We go. So I have to turn this on in order to be heard? Wow, technology. So over the centuries, the Church of Jesus Christ has wondered what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And they've leaned into this mystery. And they've had people think about it and talk about it and wonder about it. And that's what equipping the saints is in part. It is about leaning into discipleship and wondering how to be disciples more fully and better. In this case tonight, John's not going to talk so much about that, but John's going to talk about the history of the Scots-Irish relative to Western North Carolina. I did not know that they had so much to do with the foundation, the founding and the sustaining of this young nation, but they did, and you all do, because you know about, are they the mountain boys? Over mountain men. See, you know about them because you're from here. But he'll be talking about that among other things and helping us to understand and find our place in this history in which we find ourselves right now. Screw on your thinking caps because he's going to ask some questions, and he's going to ask some questions of you all, so pay close attention. Let's pray together. Holy God, for your love we give you thanks, and for the way you are with us on the journey. Continue to guide our steps, we pray, for we ask it in the name of Jesus. And the people of God together say, Amen. Please help me welcome our very own John Lafferty.
Okay, now, so I'm 200, have we got a mic on? We're on, good. So I'm 275 years old. My name is John Kirkpatrick from Charlottetown. That is my 7th great-grandfather, and we're going to talk a lot about that. We spend a lot of time in this church talking about the ethnic group known as the Waldensians, and well might we should. They founded this church. They have a great story of faith. But tonight, we're going to talk about a different ethnic group. Happens to be mine. And we're going to talk about some of the similarities between the Waldensians. For one thing, the Waldensians in this country and the way they run their government, church government in Italy, is a Presbyterian form of government, and we are all Presbyterians. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask you questions, so you better get your thinking caps on, and we're going to have a lot of fun tonight, I hope. And I hope that if the sin of pride doesn't creep into your soul too much, I hope at the end of this lecture you'll have just a little bit of pride for the fact that you are Presbyterian and that you're American. Well, let me ask first of all, I want to see is anybody here Irish? Anybody got a little Irish background in them? Raise your hand high. All right, so I've got quite a bit. What about Scot? Who's a Scot? Okay. Anybody British, just straight British, which is different, okay? And how about Scots-Irish? Good. I heard somebody say, what is that? I want to know how many of you can raise your hand to say you absolutely are certain you know what the definition of that term is. Scots-Irish. All right, who is here that's not sure about that? Scots-Irish, okay. If you think it's, well, I have certain relatives that came over from Scotland and certain relatives that came over from Ireland and others from England, so I guess I'm Scots-Irish, you would not be correct. Scots-Irish has, and I know for many months and years that has been burning in your soul to want to know the answer to that question, and you came this very moment to the right place here in Pioneer Hall, because you're going to walk out of this lecture and you're going to know what that is. Now, our history in Western North Carolina of this ethnic group goes very, very deep, and you know some of it. You know the population that this is populated by Scots-Irish people that came hundreds of years, at least 150 years before the Waldensians, for sure. Now, I want to give you a brief thing because we're going to talk about history. When I give a talk in history, especially to a group of people that are amateur historians, I get a little nervous because history, the science of medicine, which was my former position in life, is actually a very inexact science. We have to kind of use the art of medicine and the science of medicine. It's the same with history. You're going back and you're trying to recreate things and try to explain things that happened a long time ago. And what happens, kids, is things that happened a long time ago, it's subjective, and a lot of things are facts are woven with myth. George Washington threw $1 over the Delaware. Almost certainly that didn't happen. That's folklore. Did he chop down the cherry tree? A lot of people wonder, I did not tell a lie when he went into his father? I don't know. A lot of that is myth. And some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight have been questioned as to whether they really happened. Facts are forgotten. We all know, the grown-ups in the room know that if there's an auto accident and you're standing on this corner and the other guy's standing on this corner, they're not going to see exactly the same thing when the police report comes out. And certainly in something like a battle or a war, that's going to be true. So, hopefully I'm an ethical historian tonight, and I'm going to do my very best to try to get it right, okay? Now, let's talk and go back and talk about the Revolutionary War, but I'm going to digress because we've got these young people. I'm wearing a costume or a uniform. We call it a kit, not a uniform, and this is very authentic. This is exactly the way a gentleman, which is a sort of a higher class, would look in 1776, which Jonas was what? 1776 was a famous year. What happened then? I know. What? The U.S. was founded, exactly. And if you were showing up in Charlottetown, my forebear would look very much like this. This is called a tricorn hat. Anybody know what the word tri means? 3. Yeah. Before you can ride a bicycle, you learn to ride a tricycle. Triceratops, one of our favorite dinosaurs. Tricorn hat. This is called a frock coat. This is called a waistcoat. We would say waistcoat, but the British say waistcoat. And these are the pants and the long socks. These shoes sort of give me away. They are Benjamin Franklin shoes. The buckle is kind of fancy, so I'm sort of more of the upper class. I own land and that kind of thing. Okay, let's talk. If we're going to talk about the Scots-Irish, we've got to talk about the history. And you're very lucky that you live here in Burke County because the history of this county was huge in the founding of the United States of America. Basically, this is the 2-minute Cliff Note easy form. Steve, you used Cliff Notes in college, didn't you? Yes, sir. This is Cliff Notes. All right. American Revolutionary War broke out in 1776. It occurred because there had been a war beforehand called the French and Indian War. The English call it the 7 Years' War. The English fought against the French and won, and greatly expanded the territory where settlers could go, and the French were kind of forced up north into Canada. But as a result, it cost a lot of money to run a war, and the coffers or the treasury of the British was depleted. And the British in Parliament said, you know what? Those American colonists have benefited from this, and so we're going to get them to pay for this war. We're going to tax them. We're going to put taxes on stamps and other things and, all sorts of goods. And the British colonists said, well, give us representation in Parliament. And they said, no, that's really for real British citizens. You don't get to have a representative come over in Parliament. And that's called taxation without representation. It wasn't the amount of the tax they were upset about. It was the fact they weren't being represented. And as the things went on, people started to say, you know, we're 3,000 miles away. We feel more like we have our own country. And one thing led to another. There were several outbursts of violence, certainly in 1773. They had taxed everything but tea. I mean, they took away the tax on everything but tea. And they said, well, we don't want you to tax tea either. Said, well, no, we're going to tax tea. And so they threw all the tea in the Boston Harbor in the river. And the king said, well, we're going to close your port and starve you out. The difference in that was the people down south and the people in the middle colony said, we identify with them and not with the crown. And things started to heat up. As you know, the quick and dirty was eventually, we had on July the 4th, 1776, almost 250 years ago, we had the Declaration of Independence. And the war broke out. And England did not seem to be able to subdue this insurgency. They couldn't capture Washington, and people started to get upset about this in England and said, you know, why aren't you winning the war? Why aren't you putting down this rebellion? And Lord North, who was the prime minister at the time, offered to resign, okay? And King said, no, you come up with Lord Germain, who was the Secretary of American Affairs at the time, kind of like our Secretary of State, said, you develop a new strategy. And they sat and they said, you know, down south, there are a lot of Tories. Now, a Tory is somebody who lives in America but did not want to be an independent country. They wanted to stay part of Britain, okay? And there's lots of them down south. They have it pretty good under the British Crown. And I think if we send a bunch of ships down there and capture the big cities, we're going to recruit these people and we're going to gradually move north. So, Sir Henry Clinton went down and captured Savannah and captured Charleston. The person at Charleston that had to surrender was a guy named Benjamin Lincoln, for whom Lincoln County is named. It is not named for Abraham Lincoln. It is Benjamin Lincoln. And they moved north, and they were winning. They won a battle at Camden. Horatio Gates ran away. He was the patriot that was leading the American forces. And they moved into the little hamlet of Charlottetown, where my forebears were. And they won another battle, and Lord Clinton went back to Boston because he had it pretty good up there, and he left a guy in command called Lord Cornwallis, and Cornwallis was in charge of this. So Cornwallis moves into Charlottetown, and he says, we've got to have some really good soldiers guarding our rear flank. And the meanest, nastiest guy in the British Army, a guy named Bannister Tarleton with his dragoons, and dragoons are nothing more than guys on horseback. And they were the cavalry, and they guarded the southern flank. We don't need to guard the eastern flank. They're full of Tories. We're happy with that. We've got to guard the western flank. There's some real patriots up north and west of Charlottetown. We've got to have, and there were pockets of resistance. There was a guy named Andrew Pickens, for which Pickens, South Carolina is named. Francis Marion, for which the town seat of McDowell County is named. The so-called Swamp Fox made life miserable, but the British basically was winning. So Ferguson, who was in command now of this Western force, sent a message up to this area. Now this is Major Patrick Ferguson. Major Patrick Ferguson was an older guy. He was probably the best soldier in the entire British Army. He invented what's called the breech-loading rifle, for those that don't know about weapons. You know, normally they put the bullet down in the barrel and rammed it down. This was loaded near the stock. He could put it in. It wasn't used much in the Revolutionary War, but he was really a pretty sharp guy. But he sent a threat up to the area, to the people that lived up in this very area of Burke County and up into the mountains of what is present-day Tennessee. And he said, you desist in your opposition from the British arms and take protection under his standard, or I will march my army over the mountains and hang your leaders and lay your country to waste with fire and sword. So, this message came up to the people that lived up here who did not have a regular army, but they had militia. Militia are just local units of people. They all had guns, and they would get together in case there was trouble. So, Steve Mullis, what would be your response to that? There's several things you could do. You could run away, you could surrender, or you could wait until Ferguson brought his forces up in the mountains. That would be a good strategy. And they did none of those three things. Instead, 7 militia groups got together at various points, and they came down to Burke County, North Carolina, to present-day Morganton, and they camped out on the evening of September 30th, 1780, not 10 miles from where we're sitting right now. And they went across that Catawba River at Greenlee Ford looking for Patrick Ferguson. They said, we've had enough. 1,400 men gathered there. They took the 900 best and they rode down, and the bottom line is they found Ferguson, who had found out they were coming, and he camped himself on top of a small mountain in between the North and South Carolina called Kings Mountain. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So, they said, some men from over the mountain came in large force against us. So who were these over mountain men? And what did they do to change the course of history? Why such a ferocious response? They were really angry. When did the animosity they had towards Ferguson and the British really begin? Did it begin the week they went? No, it was much earlier. Who are the true origins of these mountain people, and how did this all play out? And in order for us to circle back around to Kings Mountain, we're going to have to go back in history. Now, you saw the picture, the famous loose drawing of them crossing over Greenlee Ford. And there's no question that there were a few African American slaves, there were Swedes, there were Germans. We got some Germans in here. Yeah, there were Germans. But by far the largest group of people in that army were the Scots-Irish. Now, we have to go back. I want you to think about a man or a woman, it could be a woman, born in 1450 and died in 1520. Now, we're living in what we think are very turbulent times, and I think we are living in very turbulent times. But a person living during those 70 years experienced 3 things. I've given one of them away already. And if you've listened to this lecture before, you don't get to respond. But there were 3 things of such monumental historical significance. It was a millennium change in the way the entire Western culture played out from that point on. 3 things. One was an invention. One was a discovery. And one was a revolt against an entrenched power. I've already shown you one, so if you were paying attention to the slides, what was the invention? The printing press, the Gutenberg printing press. Why is that so important? All of a sudden, up until that time, basically only educated clergy and the monks could read because it was so difficult to reproduce things. Remember, we didn't have computers, but this completely revolutionized things, and it allowed gradually over those 100 years for people to start to read. And when you read, you learn, and when you learn, Elsie, you start questioning things, and they question a lot about other things, about government and religion and science and everything else that they have been taught. Okay, so you've got the invention down. The discovery. Nobody gets to answer if they've heard my lecture. It was a monumental discovery. It changed everything about the world. What was the discovery? What? They sort of knew that already, okay, but you're getting there. Nobody. Kids, what was the discovery? Huh? Nope. Gunpowder had been invented by the Chinese several hundred years earlier. Of course, we made it en masse, as the Scots-Irish did. The automobile. You're an anachronistic wonder. Discovery, huh? Yes. Columbus discovered America. Now, of course, we know the Vikings had come earlier, but they didn't record it, okay? But when he discovered it, all of a sudden, within a few years, they realized that isn't the West Indies. That's a whole new continent. And there was something else going on already. There was the rise of the nation states. And the nation states included the ones you know, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, okay, France, and England. And they all said, we've got to get whatever goods are out of there and whatever land before they do. And it created the largest migration of people in the history of the world. And so now the third thing was a revolt against an entrenched power, and it changed everything also. What was the entrenched power? Man, my hearing. Habsburg. No. There was an entrenched power. It was the most powerful institution on earth. Come on, the Roman Catholic Church. And this guy was credited with starting the Reformation, but we in this room know that that is not exactly true. Things weren't just hunky-dory with the Roman Catholic Church until October the 31st, 1517, when he decided, I'm going to nail some propositions against the church door and have a debate about this because I don't like what's going on. If you think that's when the Reformation started, you are sorely mistaken, and all the people in this room will educate you because you're Waldensians, and you have been seeing that there was a problem with the Roman Catholic Church for several hundred years. But we'll give him credit because truly he was very powerful and things started to blow up. And remember, what was fueling it was books and people reading and thinking. And then, of course, there was all these nation states. Now, you've got to understand that there were 5 nation states in Europe, and Spain was by far the most powerful. And they were first out of the blocks. They were the ones that financed Columbus's voyage, right? Anybody remember Queen Isabella? And you do. Queen Isabella and Ferdinand of Aragon. The 1492 was a big year in Spain. They merged those two kingdoms. They decided, and they decided as the language of Spanish, which I'm very fond of, started to be more universalized. There were all these dialects, and there still are in Spain. But the one that dominated was not Ferdinand's, but good old Isabella, women's rights, there you go. And it's called Castellano. That's what modern Spanish really is. Okay, and so they had all the power, and they went off. And what did they do? They drove out the French in Florida and in South Carolina at present-day Parris Island, and the successors of Ferdinand and Isabella, a guy named Philip II, said, we're going to send a bunch of men over here. And they did. And they couldn't feed them all, so they divided them in half and said, you go to the interior of La Florida, which is North America, and find a silver route for our mines in Mexico. And they wound up where? In Burke County at Jawara. I've got to put a plug in for Jawara in 1567. So Burke County is big in the Revolutionary War, and Burke County is big for Spanish colonialization. It didn't last very long, but they were here. Okay. Now, so they were all fighting, but things change in the world. People that are powerful are not so powerful. The Nazis aren't so powerful now, are they? They were at one time in the 30s. And last England, but that was about to change because a singular personality arose in the island of England that was so charismatic and so powerful that he would also change the course of history and the Scots-Irish. And whom am I talking about? No, we're into the 1500s. We're talking 1500s. This was a king, and this was a very powerful king of England. Henry VIII. Yes. Such a consequential personality only arrives on the world stage every 100 years, and there he is. And Henry VIII is known for a lot of things. For one thing, he was listed as a defender of the faith. The Pope just loved him until he married, believe it or not, the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, whose name was Catherine. Catherine had a problem. Dealt with it a lot in my medical practice. It's called infertility. She couldn't give him an heir, and he wanted to divorce her, and that was not allowed in the Catholic Church. And he went to Pope Clement, and he said, I want a divorce or an annulment, and Clement said no. And King Henry VIII, being the kind of nice guy he was, said, to H with you, I'm going to be the head of my own church in England. There we go. So he had to consolidate his power also. You know, he worried. Now he was basically turned into a Protestant, and he made himself in the back door part of the Protestant Reformation. So now he had to worry about the fact that now they had chosen sides, and the Catholics were against the Protestants. So he started worrying about places around him, and there's a little island next to England called Ireland, and Ireland was full of Catholics. So he took over Catholic Ireland. He had a big army, and he did it by taking the lands of the earls and then giving it back to them to ensure their loyalty. And he was really just too preoccupied with France and all that to worry too much about America. And he ran into two major problems. He went through 6 wives, you know, right? Everybody remembers 6 wives. And he wound up with, he divorced 2, killed 2, and 1 died in childhood. He divorced 2, 2 died, 2 were executed, Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn was very important from who her offspring was. And he did develop with Jane Seymour, his 3rd wife, he had a male heir. But the problem with Edward VI was he too was very sickly and didn't last very long. And there was a bunch of civil conflict, but never fear, Roger. A new leader would emerge in England that was even more powerful than Henry. And this individual was very powerful, ushered in amazing cultural advance. But the most amazing thing about this leader was this leader wasn't even a man. Who was it? Elizabeth I, and there she is. Yes, Elizabeth I. And she ushered in a period of stability. She defeated the Spanish on the naval battle of the Spanish Armada. She ruled for almost 50 years. There was a period of cultural stability. There was a certain playwright in England and then that had some staying power. What was his name? Shakespeare, yes. So they were very culturally sophisticated, and they established a colony in the New World. Where was that colony? Roanoke, in the state of North Carolina. Man, are we famous. It didn't last very long anyway, but Queen Elizabeth, the mother the queen that was still alive when Henry died was Catherine Parr, who was a ferocious Protestant, and so Elizabeth grew up Protestant. But good things all come to an end in 1603. Elizabeth dies, and the heir apparent was this guy. And this guy was another ferocious Protestant. Now, he did a lot of things, and he did a lot of things in Ireland, and we're about to get to the true Scots-Irish. But he did one thing for which he is very famous. Does anybody know what that is?
Commission of translation.
Yes, it's this thing right here. I have an authentic copy. It's the King James version of the Bible. There he is, 1611. There are parts of it. We even get our ministers to use the 23rd Psalm in this version because it is so beautiful, and it hasn't been a lot of things. There's some things that we think scholars think are a little inaccurate about this, but bottom line is there is the King James version of the Bible. And King James said, Elizabeth has established some colonies, and I'm really worried about Ireland. And Roger, what the major problem with Catholic Ireland is? It's full of Catholics. And we're going to get rid of them. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to use my countrymen that are very loyal to me, the Lowland Scots, and we're going to send them over to the northern part of Ireland where we've run off the O'Neills, and we're going to establish a colony in Northern Ireland. And so these Scots moved to Ireland, to the northern part of Ireland. Now you think, what does that have to do with modern causal society? It's huge because those 6 northern counties have provided a source of problem for the world ever since. Anybody remember the Irish Republican Army and all the attacks in the 60s and 70s? That's what this is all about. The Catholics that were left behind, including the family of my son-in-law, were abused by the Protestants. I like to say that because it's true, and they were the ones that were the outs, and they didn't like the presence of the Protestants and the presence of the British. Remember, Northern Ireland is part of England, And he found a great group of people. Ulster Plantation. When you talk about Scots-Irish to a British person, they'll say, who are you talking about? If you say Ulster Scot, said, Ulster Scot, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's these 6 counties in Northern Ireland. So, you've got County Tyrone, which Laura and I have been to, which is Cookstown, where my son-in-law is from. You have County Antrim, and you see down in between County Antrim to the right and County Down, you have a town called Belfast. Everybody remembers Belfast being in the news. And just north of that, you had a family called the McDowells who moved. And just south of that, you had a family called the Kirkpatricks and the McAdams, and those are my people. So, how did these Ulster Scots do these Scots-Irish as they became or to become, how did they do when they moved over there? Well, they did really well. They were excellent soldiers. They successfully fought the Catholics. They were expert sheep and cattle farmers. They were great weavers. And they got so good that the British started to say, these people are a problem now. They're competing with our people, and they're better at weaving cloth than we are. And they're better at raising cattle than we are. And we've got to do something about it because they're really not our people, really. And there was another problem they had. England, after Henry VIII, became the Church of England. It was an Anglican church, and these people did not want to be part of it. They took their religion very seriously, and it wasn't the Church of England. So, they started to do things to them, to discriminate against them. Trade embargoes. No public office for you, no university education for you. What does that sound like? Does that sound like another group that you know in this church? Yes, of course. It's just the way people, sinful people, are. King William said, you can't export cattle or sheep to England from Ulster. Wool can only go to England because we're going to rack up the price. And y'all aren't going to get anything left over. We're even going to fix it so if you get married outside the Anglican church, your marriage is invalid, and else all your children are illegitimate. And when the leases ran out, they racked up the rent. That's called rack renting, if you understand that term. So, where did these lowland Scots get their religion? Well, it was mainly from this guy. These seminarians have to know something about this man. His name was John Knox, and he was a Scot who had problems with the Catholic Church and believed in a different form of religion and of Christian religion. And he went over to France and he studied under this guy. Who would that be? No, I'm talking to, nope, it was a very prominent Protestant figure in world history John Calvin. John Calvin, the guy that wrote 1,600-page Institutes of the Christian Religion, which mostly deals with the form of government, and only 100 of the 1,600 pages has to do with what he is most known for, which is predestination, which we're not going to get into. But John Calvin was born in 1509, died in 1564. He had the most outsized presence on the Protestant religion of just about anybody, including Luther. So, now we get to talk about church government. Pay attention. There are only really three ways that you can order your church. The first is called an episcopal form of church government. That basically, and listen to how it's described, you basically have an individual that's in a high position that makes decisions. He may filter it down for lesser individuals, but basically he is the decider. He decides which ministers or whatever go into the various churches. He has a lot of power, and the power is invested in him. Give me an example of that, an episcopal form of church nowadays. The most common, the most famous would be the Catholic Church, of course, whose power is residing ultimately in the Pope. And then he has cardinals and archbishops and bishops or whatever. The Lutheran Church runs somewhat that way. Certainly the Church of England does. I want to give you an interesting aside about the Waldensians. You do remember a guy named Charles Beckwith who founded schools for the Waldensians. Charles Beckwith was a British soldier who had lost his leg in the Battle of Waterloo, came over and did a lot of good, and he loved the Waldensians. The Waldensians loved him, but they had one thing that they disagreed on, and it was the form of church government. Beckwith wanted the Waldensians to essentially join the Church of England, and the Waldensians said, no, we're going to have our own church government. So, now, the second form, so you get that, the Lutherans, the Episcopals, certainly the Catholics. The second form of church government is just the opposite. Every church is its entity unto itself. The minister and the church council is totally responsible for that church. They don't have to answer to any other churches anywhere else. Give me an example of that form of government in the United States in churches. What denomination? The Baptist. The Southern Baptist is an excellent example of that. Congregationalists up north, more up north, are that way. And any independent church. The third way is the Presbyterian way. Happens to be the way we do things. Church government is shared. The pastors have certain powers. The elders have certain powers called presbyters. We share the power. We are checks on them. They are checks on us. The congregation chooses their pastor, but through a wider body of courts. Okay? There is oversight by higher bodies. There's a system of checks and balances in this system. And Calvin, all Christian religions talk about the sinfulness of man, but Calvin did it in spades. He was on steroids when it came to talking about the sinfulness of man. And he believed that if you didn't do it this way, evil men, and he believed the Pope to be evil, would take over and dominate, okay? And an educated ministry is now a must because we're not relying on the Pope or a man to make decisions about religion. We have to read the Bible, and in order to do that, you have to be literate, okay? So, I have written some things just to flesh this all out. Yeah, there's an elected group of people that the church leads that are called presbyters. It's a representative or Republican with a little R form of government. You allow the elders to make decisions for you, but they can't make every decision because we've got a constitution that says when you're talking about a change in the pastor's salary or changing ministers or buying property, you elders can't do that on your own. You have to bring it to us and we vote. But if other things like hiring other people or spending the money, we're trusting you to do that for us, okay? There is oversight by higher powers. We have a presbytery and a synod over us. We can also appeal to them. And we govern ourselves by a document. Happens to be this one. It's called the Book of Order. And every time, and there's certain elders that look at this quite often, to make decisions about this. What does this form of government sound like to you? Something else that's in our secular life. The United States government, you get the cries. Yes, it's just amazing how this looks like that. So, what about the Ulster Scots going back to England? They had the Test Acts. Test Acts means you're loyal to the Anglican Church or you can't. That's your test. And they said, well, I'm not loyal to the Anglican Church. Well, you don't get to do anything in society. You failed. There's religious prohibitions. There are embargoes. There are famines. A disease struck cattle. Carolyn Warren, if this was hitting with you, and remember the three main things that happen to society, you've got a Bible in your hand, you're now a Protestant, and the third thing is you know that there's a continent over waiting for you. Would you stay in Ireland or would you leave? You would stay. What about the rest of you? Anybody leave? Well, 40% of the population between 1700 and 1850, in fact, did leave Ireland. And just between 1710 and 1770, 1/3 of the Protestants left. The McDowells left. and my ancestors left during that time. And where did they go? Well, first of all, they got off the boat and they went to New England, and they ran into a group called the Puritans. Now, the problem with the Scots-Irish is they were pretty strict about their morals, but they liked having a good time. They liked singing and dancing. Shock. I'm looking at Lori over there. And Cotton Mather, the quintessential Puritan, said, these Scots-Irish, these Ulster people, they're the most God-provoking Democrats this side of hell. Get rid of them. And they left. And they moved to Pennsylvania. Why? Because William Penn, the Quaker, was more tolerant of religion, and he invited them to come. But he was a pacifist. Remember, Quakers don't fight. But the practical reality for Penn is they had somebody on their western flank that was giving them problems called the Indians. And he needed somebody to deal with it. And he didn't want it to be the Quakers, so he said, these are the people. They've been fighting the Catholics. They know how to use guns. We'll put them out there on the western part of Pennsylvania, and that'll take care of things for us. But as they started to get successful there, and the French and Indian War broke out, as I've mentioned, and they were the Scots-Irish were a main part of that. They formed the backbone of the fighting force. But Penn raised their rent, and now the Ulster Scots were left with a large country, rack renting. They weren't liked where they were, and they knew that there were other people that had moved to other places. So they were used to moving, so they moved. And they went south. And this is how we're going to get to North Carolina. The people in North Carolina in this part of the country did not go from the east to the west. They came down from the north, okay, from Pennsylvania along something called the Great Wagon Road. And you see it right there. You can see parts of it today if you go out in the woods. And you can see where that line goes. It goes right through Charlottetown, North Carolina, and another branch goes to the west. And so, western North Carolina became populated with Presbyterian Scots-Irish between 1710 and 1780, okay? And you remember what the British did to them, and you remember what they were like and what they believed in, okay? They habitated the frontiers of Virginia, North and South Carolina. There was plenty of land, and they could practice their religion. The Anglicans and the landed gentry in the east sort of said, you know, this is a good deal for us. You Presbyterians, we'll let you have your land. We'll let you have your religion. There's Indians in western North Carolina too, and you keep them away from us, and we'll all just be really happy. And by the way, the land up here isn't very farmable. But something very significant was happening. If you think about a person coming to America from Germany, they'll say, well, I'm German and I've moved. If they're from Britain, they'll say, I'm a British citizen. But what about these people? They weren't Scot. They had moved 150 years earlier. They certainly weren't Irish. They had just interloped into Northern Ireland and then got basically run off. They certainly didn't feel British from the way they had been treated, and they didn't claim to be part of a particular state because they kept moving. So they may be the first people in this continent to say, I am an American, and that's a big deal. They were loyal to clan over wider government. They did believe in government. They had a governmental process, but they were a little suspicious of power. They weren't afraid to borrow ideas from other people. They saw the Swedes building houses, and they said, they do it better than us. We're going to build the way they build. And they're the ones that carried the log cabin across the mountains after the war, not the Swedes, because there weren't very many of them. They had a strange musical style, and they played fiddle and guitar, Jim Cockerham, And they noticed the African American slaves stringing a gourd and plucking it. And they said, you know, we can use that, and we're going to call that instrument what they call it. And it became the backbone of bluegrass and country music. It's called the banjo. So they weren't afraid to borrow other ideas. They believed in freedom of religion and speech, and they needed a college. But because there were no colleges in the colonies, and they went up to New Jersey and they founded a log college there, okay, in the little town of Princeton. Exactly. And they got this guy to come over. He is the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence. Happens to be Scots-Irish. Happened to have been the president of Princeton University. He was a Scotch-Irish theologian. And who was his most famous pupil at Princeton right before the war broke out? Who? Nope. He was to have an outsized presence after the war in formulating the kind of government that we have. He was the guy that we point to. No. 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 Madison. Who said Madison? Good job. There he is. He's known as the father of the Constitution. He's the guy that after the war sat at every one of those meetings and negotiated between the warring factions. And you remember whose knee he was almost literally sitting on to get all of his ideas about the nature of man and the government. It was this Witherspoon. Now, I can't find any references to say, you know, when I was sitting down thinking about the way the new government ought to be, I borrowed the Presbyterian form of government. But I think you would have to be awful naive to think that it's merely a coincidence that the Presbyterian form of government, form of church government was not put forth by Madison.
The 80 essays that were the Federalist Papers, he wrote 29.
Yes, he wrote the Federalist Papers along with John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. Exactly, correct. And this was, the Federalist Papers were the defense to say, we've got this Constitution and we need you states to ratify it, and here are the reasons, back when people read extensively because they didn't have TVs and computers, and he put out this series of papers, and you can read them today, and they're beautiful.
John Jay wrote 3, Madison wrote 29, and Hamilton wrote the other 1.
Right, Hamilton was the main author. You are correct about that. But Madison was in there, in the background. Boy, I'm having a hard time. Okay, so huffing and puffing. Let's get back to 1776. A lot of discord. We signed the Declaration of Independence, and the Ulster Scots that lived up here were clearly on the side of the Patriots. They didn't like the British. Y'all got that by now, okay? In the North, they formed the bulk of Washington's troops. I've got quotes. Washington said, if defeated everywhere else, John Williams, I'll make my last stand with the Scots-Irish. English parliamentarian Rumpole said, there's no use in crying about it. Cousin America has run off with a Presbyterian parson, and that's the end of it. There was a Hessian soldier that said, you can call this war what you will, but this is a Scotch-Irish Presbyterian war. And King George referred to the insurgency against his crown as the Presbyterian War. But in the South, the Southern Scots-Irish were on the Patriot side, but they had some other issues they were dealing with. Until 1780, they were far removed from the fight. It was mostly up north. there was a constant fear of Indians. They had to worry about that with their families. And they had a little bit of suspicion of the Continental Army because it was kind of run by Anglicans and high-class people, and they weren't that way. So most of them stayed home, but they had active militias, Roger, and they all had rifles, and they knew how to use them, okay? So here we come back to 1780, and Lord North says, you know what? We just need to get out of this war. And he offered his resignation, and we have, of course, with Lord Germain, the Southern strategy. They took Savannah. They took Charleston. They routed the forces of Gates at Camden. They move into North Carolina, and then they issue the threat. And we're back to where we started, okay? How we doing? Great. So I told you that they had all these options, Steve, but they chose to form a mass and go after Ferguson. Militias from Tennessee, present-day Tennessee. Tennessee did not exist in the Revolutionary War. It's part of North Carolina. Led by Sevier and Shelby. Virginia by William Campbell. Burke County, led by the two McDowell brothers. Wilkes County, bringing in the militia under Cleveland, and Surrey County under Winston. Does anybody know those names? They're all towns now named for these people, okay? And they converged at Quaker Meadows, 1,400 patriots, just 10 miles away. And the best equipped went on looking for Patrick Ferguson and his band of 1,000 trained Tories, and they found them on Kings Mountain. Of the seven militia leaders, 4 were Scots-Irish. The two McDowells and Campbell and Cleveland. There was a pre-battle sermon that was given on the Battle of Gideon and Jericho, an appropriate sermon for the occasion, by Samuel Doak, who was a Presbyterian minister. Other militia leaders were uniting with them, and on Saturday, October the 7th, everybody know about the Battle of Kings Mountain. I'll give you a brief summary. They had the great advantage that the day before it had rained. You know, there's leaves on the ground, and as they approached the mountain, the British, the Tories, we'll call them Tories. How many British-born British soldiers fought in the Battle of Kings Mountain? This is 2,000 people. Can anybody tell me how many were truly British? Patrick Ferguson himself. This was a civil war between Tories that wanted to stay part of England and patriots that wanted to break away and form something else, okay? And so the British had an advantage in that they could attach something to the end of their rifle that was very dangerous. It was called a bayonet. It was a big knife, and they could run down the mountain. They had the mountain, run down the mountain at the Patriots. But the Patriots had 2 big advantages. Number 1, they learned how to fight Indian style from fighting in the French and Indian War. Fighting Indian style means you're hiding behind a tree and you jump out from a tree and shoot, as opposed to marching in a line, which is very difficult to do in the woods, which is what Kings Mountain is. Go there sometime. It's woods. And the other thing is their rifles were very accurate. The British Brown Bess was not as accurate, and when the British sympathizers fired, it all went over the heads of the Patriots as they charged up the mountain. So, in 1 hour, the battle was over. I am no military historian, but this has to be one of the most one-sided victories by any force over another. In 1 hour, the Tories suffered 244 killed, 163 wounded, and 668. All the others were captured. The few others ran away. The Patriots suffered but 28 casualties, and another 5 died of their wounds within the next few days. Cornwallis found out about it 2 days later, and he panicked. His whole western flank had been wiped out. And He said, what are we going to do? He said, we're going to get out of Charlotte. And as he was leaving, my Scotch-Irish forebears made life very difficult for him and shot at him. And he wrote in his diary that night, folks, this place, Charlottetown, is a hornet's nest of rebellion. Lord Cornwallis is still the only British general in history to name an NBA basketball team. That is a true statement. That one we don't have to look up. Cornwallis, the battle was not over on that day. The war lasted one more year, but from that moment on, the British were always on the defensive and eventually lost the colonies. Scholars will debate from time immemorial, when did the war turn? But for me, on that mountain and in that day and hour, colonial America, ruled by a king across an ocean 3,000 miles away, began to crumble, die, and fade away. And in its place, our forebears did indeed raise up a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, an aspirational goal that we are still working on 250 years later. The Scotch-Irish did not unilaterally secure American independence, but I hope that this talk has given you the insight to realize that without the Scots-Irish, American independence never would have been won, and probably our current form of government would have never been formed. Thank you. So what happened to the Scots-Irish? Well, these guys went back to their farm. They were untrained soldiers, and they went back to farming and taking care of their family. But what happened to them long term? Does anybody know? Well, who raised their hand in this room? You blended into the fabric of American culture, okay? Yes, and we are the descendants of these people to a large degree. Many of you raised your hands. And they have contributed in a great many ways to American culture. Certainly presidents as diverse as Jackson, Grant, and this is going to shock you, Barack Obama, Scotch-Irish. You think Barack Obama's father was a Kenyan African black man. His mother was white and Scotch-Irish, okay? And he traces his mother's lineage back to these people, okay? What about other things? What about music? Dolly Parton is Scotch-Irish. Certainly Johnny Cash has Scotch-Irish background, and that unique form of American music is theirs. And I want to say one final preaching point. There's many things we have in common here, being Presbyterian and a lot of us being Scotch-Irish and others, but there's one thing we 100% have in common. You know what it is? We are all immigrants.
Rachel, where's Rachel? Tell us about the door prizes.
On 3 chairs in this room, there are numbers, a number 1, a number 2, and a number 3. Look on the back of your chair. If you have a card hanging there with a number on it, you will get one of these flowers.
Raise your hand. Raise your hand. There we go. Right here. Here's one. Sam gets one. Here we go. Miss Elsie gets one. One, two, three. Let's hear for John Lafferty. And let's pray together. Holy God, continue to help us to grow and bless us this night, this new night of daylight savings time. Bless us and keep us and guide us and use us. For we ask it in the name of Jesus the Christ, who was not Scots-Irish. And the people of God together say, Amen. Thank you all. Just leave your stuff on the tables. We'll get it up.